Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we bring to life the hidden stories of America's past. If you love history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey back in time. Now, let's step into the story. America before freedom was a land heavy with silence, yet alive with restless breath. It was a country not yet a country, a land where rivers cut through forests so thick that sunlight rarely touched the ground, where smoke from native fires curled into the sky above endless prairies, and where small colonial towns clung to the edges of an untamed world. This was a place both full of promise and full of chains. Beneath the surface of the hopeful songs and sermons, there were truths hidden, buried truths that shaped the very bones of what would become the United States. When we think of America's beginnings, we imagine pilgrims stepping off wooden ships, muskets raised in defiance, flags flying high, prayers whispered over bread and salt pork. But behind these clean images was something far harder, far darker, and far more human. The first settlers did not find a paradise. They found hunger, sickness, and fear. They found land that belonged to others, land that carried stories, graves, and memories long before English boots pressed into its soil. And from the very start, America's dream of freedom was born tangled with blood, survival, and the silence of those who would never see liberty dot in the early 1600s. Jamestown was no shining city. It was mud, hunger, and the stench of death. Men stumbled through swamps with swollen bellies from drinking foul water, their skin stretched thin over bones. They wrote letters home, begging for food, begging for more people, begging for help. The starving time of 1609 and 1610 left corpses piled against the palisade walls, their thin hands clawing toward heaven, as if asking why God had abandoned them. And yet, this is the soil where freedom's roots were said to take hold. Even in those early years, before independence was ever a thought, the truth was clear. Freedom in America would never be simple. It would always cost lives. Across the forests, native nations watched. The Powhatan Confederacy saw the strangers build their wooden huts, saw the axes fall against sacred trees. At first, they fed them, traded with them, even showed them how to grow corn. But soon, mistrust grew. Guns replaced open hands. Raids answered raids. A world that had been in balance for centuries shifted under the weight of new hunger, new greed. America before freedom was not a land waiting to be discovered. It was a land where two worlds collided, and neither would ever be the same again. And while the English carved their fragile homes into the wild, another shadow fell across the coast slavery. In 1619, a ship arrived carrying 20 and odd Africans. They were not settlers, not free men, but souls torn from their homes, shackled in darkness, their lives sold before they ever touched American soil. Their arrival marked something that would forever define America's story. The dream of freedom was already chained the nightmare of bondage. This truth, so often soft in memory, is one of the hidden truths that changed everything. America was built on both liberty and slavery, two forces that could not live together, yet somehow did, for centuries. Imagine those first Africans. Imagine the rocking of the ship as it cut across the Atlantic, the stench of salt, sickness, and sweat. Imagine the silence after screams, when voices were too tired to cry anymore. When they stepped onto Virginia soil, they carried no name, no protection, no hope of freedom. They were sold into lives they had never chosen. And yet, their blood, their labor, their endurance became part of the foundation of this land. There, children's children would be born into a system that stole everything yet could never fully erase their humanity. The colonies grew, fueled by hope, fear, and greed. Towns rose along the coast, their churches ringing with sermons of God's mercy, while in the fields beyond, men and women bent their backs in chains. The Puritans, fleeing persecution in England, dreamed of building a city upon a hill, a place of holiness and purity. But even their shining city cast shadows. They brought rules that crushed dissent. They saw danger in difference. Witches, they called those who stepped outside the line. The gallows in Salem were a cruel reminder that even among the faithful, freedom was not yet free. And yet the dream persisted. That is what makes this story so haunting. Even in the middle of darkness, whispers of liberty moved like a hidden wind. Farmers spoke of rights. Preachers spoke of covenants between people and God, not kings. Sailors carried tales from Europe, of revolutions, of men daring to defy thrones. The colonies were not just outposts anymore. They were beginning to believe they were something more, something new. But before freedom came, there were wars. Wars with native nations who defended their homelands with courage. Wars that scarred both sides with blood. Wars that spread across mountains and rivers, where villages burned in the night, where children hid in forests, waiting for fathers who never came back. These wars are often soft in memory, reduced to dates and treaties, but they were real. They were brutal. They were part of the price paid before freedom ever had a chance to rise. And while muskets cracked in the woods, the hidden struggle continued in the fields and cabins of the colonies. Enslaved men and women whispered songs of hope in the night, songs that carried dreams of release, even when chains weighed heavy on their wrists. Indentured servants, too, toiled under contracts that promised freedom one day, but many never lived to see it. Life in early America was hard, cruel, and often short, and yet people endured. Somehow, they endured. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were no longer just fragile outposts clinging to survival. They were alive with markets, with churches, with schools, with taverns where men debated politics over ale. The streets smelled of leather and smoke, of bread baking in stone ovens. Children ran barefoot through dirt roads, their laughter mixing with the creak of wagon wheels. This was no longer England's wilderness. It was becoming something else. But at the heart of it all, the question remained: whose freedom was being built? Whose freedom was being denied? Because America before freedom was a place of contradictions. A place where sermons rang of liberty while auctions sold human beings. A place where settlers prayed for peace even as they sharpened blades against their neighbors. A place where dreams of a new life clashed with the reality of death, disease, and endless work. It was not yet the America of fireworks and declarations. It was a rough, raw, often merciless world. But it was here, in this place of hardship and hidden truths, that the seed of freedom first pushed through the soil. And that seed would grow. It would be watered by blood and tears. It would rise through wars, rebellions, and revolutions. It would be carried forward by men and women whose names history remembers, and many whose names it forgot. America before freedom was not clean, not simple, and not pure. It was complicated. It was scarred. It was human. The story of this land before freedom is not just a story of battles and treaties. It is the story of families who left everything they knew, of nations who fought to hold on to their world, of people torn from their homes across the sea, forced to labor in silence, and of ideas dangerous, powerful ideas that began to stir in the hearts of ordinary men and women. Ideas that one day would burst into a revolution. But before that day came, before declarations and fireworks, before liberty's call echoed across the world, America lived through years of struggle that shaped its soul, years of pain and endurance, of hidden truths too often forgotten. And to understand freedom, to truly understand it, we must first look at the darkness that came before, because freedom in America was not given. It was not a gift wrapped in ribbon. It was carved, fought for, stolen back, and paid for with countless lives. And its roots, buried deep in the soil of this land, are tangled with sacrifice, injustice, and hope. This is the story of America before freedom, and it is only the beginning. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were no longer the thin, starving outposts they had once been. They had grown into towns and cities with cobblestone streets, printing presses, and harbors crowded with ships heavy with cargo. Philadelphia rang with the sound of hammers in its shipyards. Boston hummed with debates in its taverns. Charleston's markets bustled with rice, indigo, and enslaved labor. From New England to the Carolinas, a new society was taking shape, rough, raw, often divided, but alive with restless energy. And yet, beneath the growing prosperity, the soil was cracking. Freedom had become a word whispered in taverns and written in pamphlets, but it was still not for everyone. Wealthy merchants and landowners lived well, their tables full, their homes lined with fine wood and silverware imported from England. But for many, life was a daily battle. Farmers bent their backs to rocky fields, their hands blistered and scarred, their debts never quite paid. Indentured servants struggled under contracts that promised freedom after years of brutal work, though sickness or hunger often cut their time short. In the fields of the South, enslaved men and women worked from the first light of dawn until stars pierced the night sky, their labor enriching masters who spoke of liberty even as they chained others to the soil. The colonies were a patchwork, quilt stitched together with contradictions. New England Puritans spoke of moral order, while merchants smuggled goods under the noses of British tax collectors. In Virginia, gentlemen sat in grand houses sipping wine from crystal, while enslaved families lived in one-room cabins, their lives bought and sold like livestock. On the frontiers, settlers pushed deeper into native lands, their wagons carving new paths, their rifles ready. For every hymn of thanksgiving sung in church pews, there was a cry of grief in a forest, clearing where a village once stood. America before freedom was never simple. It was a land where beauty and brutality walked side by side. The British crown, though far across the ocean, was never absent. King George's shadow stretched across the colonies through governors, soldiers, and endless laws. At first, many colonists still called themselves loyal subjects. They saw England as home, a mother country, a protector. But as time went on, the weight of that mother's hand began to feel more like a chain. Taxes, tariffs, and restrictions piled up. Trade was controlled. Laws were written in London, not in Philadelphia or Boston. And the more the colonies grew, the more they began to wonder, why should they bow to a king who had never set foot on their soil? This tension was not sudden, it built slowly, like storm clouds over a summer field. One grievance piled on another. The Molasses Act of 1733, the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765. Each one was meant to draw more wealth out of the colonies and into Britain's coffers. But each one also sparked anger. Newspapers printed fiery words. Merchants grumbled in taverns. Farmers muttered by their hearths. And somewhere in those quiet complaints, something began to stir, something dangerous. The colonies were beginning to see themselves not as scattered outposts, but as one people. They were beginning to see their struggles as shared struggles. And with every tax, every insult from across the ocean, the thought grew louder. Maybe they did not need a king at all, but this was not yet a revolution. Not yet, before freedom. There was doubt, fear, division. Many colonists still clung to loyalty. They remembered the might of Britain's navy, the wealth of her empire. To break away seemed madness, suicide. And for every voice demanding liberty, there was another warning of ruin. Even so, the seeds of defiance spread. In Boston, Samuel Adams and his Sons of Liberty spoke boldly against British power. In Virginia, Patrick Henry thundered words of resistance in the House of Burgesses. Pamphlets circulated, printed on rough paper, passed from hand to hand, igniting quiet fires in kitchens and workshops. No taxation without representation, they said. Simple words, but words that cut deep. Words that began to shape a new identity. But before the colonies ever declared freedom, they faced blood. The French and Indian War, beginning in 1754, dragged the colonies into a brutal struggle for land and power. Native nations fought to defend their homelands, some siding with the French, some with the British, all hoping to protect their people from the tide of settlers. The war was long, bitter, fought in forests where musket smoke clung to the trees and rivers ran red. Settlements burned. Soldiers froze in the wilderness, their feet wrapped in rags, their bellies empty. And when the war ended in 1763, Britain claimed victory, but the colonies paid the price. Britain demanded money. Britain demanded obedience. The proclamation of 1763 closed lands west of the Appalachians, lands settlers had fought and died to win. To those living on the frontier, it felt like betrayal. To those in cities, the taxes that followed felt like chains. And across the colonies, frustration burned. And in the shadows of all this, enslaved men and women watched. Some saw war as a chance for escape. Some joined whichever side offered the promise of freedom. Others remained trapped, their lives counted as property, even as white colonists cried out for liberty. This contradiction lay at the heart of America before freedom, the truth too heavy for many to face. A land demanding liberty while denying it to millions. A land preaching rights while selling bodies on auction blocks. But history is not clean. It is not simple. Even as contradictions tore through the colonies, the idea of freedom was spreading. Like sparks leaping from one dry branch to another, Boston became a furnace of unrest. Crowds filled the streets, their voices angry, their fists clenched. In 1770, British soldiers stood tense in the cold night air as snowballs, stones, and cheers flew at them. Shots rang out, men fell, blood stained the cobblestones. The Boston Massacre, they called it. A spark that lit the fire brighter. 3 years later, another act of defiance shook the harbor. Men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships and dumped chests of British tea into the black waters. The Boston Tea Party was more than a protest. It was a declaration that the colonies were no longer afraid to strike back. Britain answered with punishment closing the harbor, tightening control, sending more soldiers. But instead of breaking the colonies, these measures bound them closer together, and in the back rooms of taverns. In candlelit meetings, men began to speak of something once unthinkable, independence, but this dream was no certainty. Families were torn. Neighbors distrusted one another. Some clung fiercely to the crown, believing rebellion was treason, madness that would destroy everything. Others pushed for liberty with fiery passion. The colonies were divided, fragile, uncertain. Before freedom came, there was confusion and fear. Still, the voices grew louder. A pamphlet published in 1776 carried words that cut like lightning across. The land. Thomas Paine's common sense called the king a tyrant and declared independence the only answer. Farmers read it by the light of their hearths. Merchants read it in their shops. Sailors carried it in their pockets. And in those pages, the impossible began to seem possible. The hidden truths of America, before freedom, came to the surface. That freedom was not given by kings, but demanded by people. That liberty required sacrifice, blood, and risk. That the contradictions of this land, its slavery, its dispossession of native nations, its harsh inequalities, would remain scars even as freedom rose. But in 1776, the colonies stood at the edge of a cliff. To leap meant war. To leap meant fire, destruction, and countless dead. To leap meant they might lose everything, but to stand still meant chains forever. The choice was no longer distant. It was here. And in the heat of Philadelphia that summer, men gathered in a hall to put words to the fire in their hearts. Words that would change not just a nation, but the world. But freedom was not yet won. Before freedom, there would be war. A long, bitter war, fought not just on battlefields, but in homes, in hearts, in the very soul of America. And that war, bloody, uncertain, costly beyond measure, was about to begin. The summer of 1776 was heavy with heat, but even heavier with destiny. In Philadelphia, in a plain hall where windows stood open to let in air, a group of men gathered to sign their names to a document that could cost them their lives. The Declaration of Independence was more than ink on parchment. It was a thunderclap across the world. In its words, the colonies declared what had once seemed impossible, that they were free, that they would no longer bow to a king in ocean. Away, we mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, they wrote, and they meant it, because with each stroke of the quill, they were signing a death warrant should they fail, but a signature did not bring freedom. It only lit the torch of war, and the war that followed was long, bloody, and uncertain, fought not just between armies, but within families, within towns, within every heart that had to choose between loyalty to Britain and the dangerous dream of independence. At first, the war was chaos. Militias of farmers, blacksmiths, and laborers took up muskets, standing shoulder to shoulder against the most powerful army in the world. The British soldiers wore bright red coats, their ranks marching in perfect step, their cannons thundering across fields. The colonists were ragged, their weapons mismatched, their training thin. Yet they fought with a stubbornness born not of skill, but of desperation. They had little to lose and everything to gain. In New York, General George Washington stood at the helm of the Continental Army. Tall, stern, and steady, he carried the weight of the revolution on his shoulders. His men looked to him not as a flawless hero, but as a symbol of their fragile cause. In August 1776, the British crushed the Americans in the Battle of Long Island. Washington's army was driven back, beaten, and nearly destroyed. But in the dark of night, under cover of fog, he led his men across the East River to safety, saving the revolution from collapse. That escape, silent oars cutting the water, men holding their breath, as British ships lay nearby, was one of the first miracles of the war. But miracles were rare. That first year was filled with retreat, loss, and despair. The redcoats seemed unstoppable. They took New York, their banners flying high over the city. They pushed Washington's army southward, leaving behind ashes and fear. Soldiers deserted, hungry and tired. Farmers returned to their fields. Some whispered that the dream of independence had already died. And then, on a bitter night in December, when hope was nearly gone, Washington struck back. Crossing the icy Delaware River, his men pushed through snow and darkness, their boots cutting into the frozen ground. At dawn, they stormed Trenton, surprising the Hessian soldiers who fought for Britain. The victory was small compared to the scale of the war, but its meaning was vast. For the first time, the ragged army had shown it could strike, could win, could breathe life back into a fading cause. The war dragged on. Battle after battle, loss after loss. Saratoga in 1777 brought a turning point as American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold forced the British to surrender. The victory convinced France to join the fight, bringing ships, money, and soldiers. Without France, the revolution might have flickered out. With them, the fire grew hotter, but victories came at a cost. Winter at Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778. was a season of suffering. Washington's men shivered in huts made of logs and mud. Frostbitten feet bled in the snow. Disease swept through the camp. Men wrapped rags around their bodies, starving, waiting, praying. And yet, through that crucible, the army did not break. With the training of Baron von Steuben, a German officer, they learned discipline, order, and strength. Out of suffering, a real army was born. All the while, civilians carried their own burdens. Families lived in fear, their homes caught between marching armies. Women carried farms on their shoulders, while husbands and sons fought. Mothers buried. Children lost to hunger and disease. Children grew up too fast, their innocence stolen by the roar of cannons and the sight of burning towns. And enslaved men and women saw in the chaos a chance for something more. Some escaped to British lines, lured by promises of freedom. Others joined the revolution, fighting in hope that liberty might finally reach them too. Their voices, though often silenced in history, were part of the chorus that cried for freedom. The war was not only against Britain, it tore through native nations as well. Some tribes sided with the crown, hoping to protect their lands from the endless tide of settlers. Others allied with the colonists, gambling on promises that often proved hollow. Villages burned, families scattered, and ancient homelands were scarred by battles that were not their own. The revolution was not only a war for freedom, but also another step in the tragic loss of native lands. And within the revolution itself, betrayal brewed. Benedict Arnold, once a hero at Saratoga, grew bitter, feeling unrecognized, unappreciated. He turned his loyalty to Britain, plotting to surrender West Point. His treason was a wound that cut deep, a reminder that even among patriots, trust could crumble. Years passed. The war stretched long, draining lives and fortunes. Britain, though mighty, grew weary. The colonies, though battered, refused to yield. The struggle became a test of endurance. Who could hold longer? Who could bleed longer? In 1781, the answer came at Yorktown. With French ships blocking the sea and American troops surrounding the land, British General Cornwallis found himself trapped. For weeks, cannons roared, earth shook, and smoke filled the sky. Finally, on October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered. The war, though not formally ended, was over in spirit. The impossible had been achieved. The colonies had stood against the empire and won, but freedom, when it came, was not simple. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 declared the United States a nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Fireworks, celebrations, church bells ringing the dream had become reality. And yet, beneath the joy, the hidden truths remained. The native nations who had fought and bled were not part of this freedom. Their lands were claimed without their voices. The enslaved men and women who had hoped for liberty found chains still waiting. Women who had carried farms, raised children, and endured loss were praised for their sacrifice, but denied the very rights they had helped secure. The revolution had birthed a nation, but it had not fulfilled the promise of liberty for all. It had cracked the door open, but many remained on the outside. Still, something had changed forever. The idea of America, a place where people could rule themselves, where no king commanded their lives, was alive. Fragile, imperfect, scarred, but alive. And from that moment on, the question would never again be whether freedom could exist in America, but how far it could reach and who it would embrace. The cost had been immense. Lives lost on frozen fields, families torn apart, dreams buried in shallow graves. But out of that cost came something that had never before existed, the United States of America. And yet, this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because the freedom won in 1783 was narrow, fragile, and incomplete. The hidden truths of America before freedom had not vanished. They lingered in slavery, in stolen lands, in the silence of those denied a voice. The revolution had raised a torch. But who would carry it next? Who would widen its light to shine on all? That question would haunt the new nation. Because America, after independence, was free in name, but still bound in many ways. And the fight for true freedom was far from over. When the guns fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, America stood at a crossroads. The war was over, the British gone, the flag of the new United States raised high over a nation born from rebellion. But peace did not bring easy answers. Instead, it revealed the deep cracks already running through the foundation. The dream of liberty was alive, but the question that lingered was this: liberty for whom? The soldiers who had marched through mud, frost, and fire returned, home with little more than scars. Many were unpaid, their pockets empty, their farms in ruin. Promises made in the heat of battle faded in the cold light of peace. Some went back to their plows, their hands blistered from work and war alike. Others limped through towns as reminders of the cost. Their sacrifices had birthed a nation, but the nation often forgot them as it turned its eyes to politics, to power, to building something new. In Philadelphia, in the very hall where independence had first been declared, leaders gathered again to shape the bones of government. The Articles of Confederation, weak and fragile, had left the new nation teetering. There was no strong center, no binding force to hold the 13 states together. Debt strangled the young republic. Farmers, taxed and desperate, rose up in rebellion, like in Shays' Rebellion of 1786, when men who had fought for liberty now stood against their own government. America seemed at risk of collapsing before it could even stand. Out of this chaos came the Constitution of 1787. It was debated, argued, written, and rewritten in sweat and candlelight. Delegates fought over representation, over power, over who counted and who did not. The final document was hailed as a miracle, a framework strong enough to hold together a divided land. It spoke of "we the people," of a government built on consent, not kings. It built checks, balances, and the seeds of democracy. But within its shining words were shadows. Slavery, the oldest scar on American soil, was written into the Constitution itself, not by name, but by compromise. Enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation, a cruel equation that gave power to slaveholders while denying humanity to those in chains. The trade in human lives was allowed to continue. The contradiction was clear. The same nation that declared all men created equal had built its government on inequality. Native nations, too, were left outside the promise. The ink on the Treaty of Paris had handed their homelands to the United States without their consent. Settlers poured westward, hungry for land. The frontier became a line of fire and fear. Villages burned, treaties broken almost as soon as they were signed. The young nation, born in the name of liberty, grew at the expense of those who had lived on this land for centuries. And women who had carried farms, raised children, and even spied, nursed, and fought during the war, were praised as the Republican mothers, guardians of virtue and home. But their voices were barred from the ballot box, their rights still bound within household walls. Freedom had come, but not for them. America, before freedom, had been a place of contradictions. America after independence remained the same. The war had won a nation, but not justice. It had secured a flag, but not equality. The hidden truths did not vanish with victory. They grew louder, demanding to be faced. Still, there was hope. The Constitution, imperfect though it was, carried within it the possibility of change. It created a system that could be challenged, amended, expanded. It left open a door, however narrow, for the torch of freedom to pass from one generation to the next. The voices silenced in 1787 would one day rise again, demanding the words of the Declaration be made true. And in those early years, the nation stumbled forward. George Washington, the reluctant president, took office in 1789, his every step watched by citizens who feared tyranny returning. He walked carefully, refusing to be called Your Majesty, insisting instead on Mr. President. His steady hand guided the fragile republic, setting precedents that would outlast him. But even as he led, whispers of division grew louder north. Against South, farmers against merchants, Federalists against anti-Federalists. The struggle for freedom was not finished. It was only beginning. The revolution had won independence, but independence was not the same as liberty. Liberty was a fire that still needed tending, a promise still unmet. And so, the hidden truths of America remained. That freedom was born. Besides slavery, that a republic of the people was built while silencing half its population. That the lands of native nations were taken in the name of liberty. These truths are uncomfortable, heavy, but they are the soil in which America's story grew. To tell of freedom without these truths is to tell only half the tale. Because the greatness of America is not found in pretending it was perfect. It is found in the struggle to make it better. When we look back at those years before and after independence, we see not a flawless march toward liberty, but a rough, painful journey. We see men signing their names to a declaration while enslaved workers stood outside the hall. We see women raising voices in letters and petitions, only to be told their place was in silence. We see native leaders fighting to protect their homelands, watching treaties crumble like dry leaves in the wind. And yet, we also see something else. We see resilience. We see the spark of an idea too powerful to die. Freedom, once declared, could never be entirely silenced again. Even when it was denied, even when it was broken, even when it was twisted by hypocrisy, it lingered, waiting, pressing forward. That is the story of America before freedom. A story not of perfection, but of struggle. Not of clean lines, but of scars. Not of easy victories, but of sacrifice that reached into every home. It is a story of starving settlers at Jamestown and enslaved men stepping off ships in Virginia, of Puritans singing hymns while gallows waited in Salem, of farmers clutching muskets at Lexington and mothers watching sons march off never to return, of treaties written and broken, of chains fastened and resisted, of a people trying again and again to live up to the words they dared to write. Freedom in America was never a gift. It was never simple. It was carved from hunger, from war, from betrayal, from hope. And it remains, even now, unfinished. The hidden truths that shaped this nation remind us that liberty is not a single moment in time, not a single declaration or treaty. It is a journey, a long, painful, beautiful journey carried forward by each generation. And when we remember America before freedom, when we face those truths without flinching, we find something deeper than myth. We find the humanity, the struggle, the resilience that made this nation possible. Because freedom in America was not born whole. It was born broken, born scarred, born incomplete. But it was born. And once born, it could not die. That is the legacy of America before freedom. A legacy of pain, yes, but also of promise. A promise still unfolding, still unfinished, still calling to us even now.